All right, and thanks for joining us. We've got Garland Favorito from voterga.org with us. Nobody knows the election system and these computerized voting machines better than this man that we have here today with us. We're going to give you something that I have never seen before on the internet. I have seen it in print from time to time, never seen it in a live podcast. We're on video. We're going to go over the history, how we got here to where we are today. We're going to start at the beginning with these voting machines, and we're going to bring it all the way to where we are today. This is going to be a 2-episode series here. The first one is just based on the history. So many people do not know the history, and they don't understand how we got here and actually where we are. So we're going to attempt to do that today, and I am going to give an apology right off the bat. There are so many minute details that we have to keep track of. I'm actually going to be reading off a script. I don't normally do that, but I just want to say for accuracy's sake, I'm going to be looking down a lot. If you see me looking down, it's because I want to make sure you get all the best information and the correct information. So, Garland, thanks for joining us, my friend.
Steve, it's good to be with you. It's been a long time, and I'm glad you're doing the show, and it's great to be on it.
Well, you know it all. So let's take it from the beginning here. Let's go to year 2000. We've got a lot of national hoopla and hysteria. It was Al Gore versus Bush Jr., and it was a slugfest. It came down to the state of Florida. And for the people who might be watching this who are too young to actually know what's going on here, give us a little idea of what happened during that election that led to all the hubbub about we've got to change the way we do voting.
Yeah, it's hard to imagine that was 25 years ago, Steve. So that's what happened. So back in 2000, before the election, nobody really cared how they voted. I was tipped off that there was this new wave of unverifiable voting coming because I went to a conference in Cincinnati. So I had a clue as to what was going to happen, but I really didn't think anything much about it. They had the election, and as you said, it came down to Florida. And it was literally hundreds of votes. I think it was 327 vote difference between Al Gore and George W. Bush. And they had the infamous recount with the hanging chads in the some punch card systems back then, and some of the ones out Palm Beach County and so on. The untold portion of this story, though, is that I think about 7 years later, about a half a dozen employees from Sequoia Voting Systems came forward to say that they believed their company shipped bad paper down to Palm Beach County in order to justify a new series of these electronic voting machines, which I was tipped off on. So you remember the hanging chads, the news media just loved that. They were all over it. I think it was all arranged that way.
And Garland, if we can too, just for younger voters who may not even know what a hanging chad is, they used a method of voting where they had a pen with a metal point in it, and you would push in the paper and you would perforate the paper, and it should have punched out the little oval type of section next to the name. That thing should have popped out all together. Then they run it through a scanner, and the scanner reads the punched paper. And
right.
The hanging chad was the perforated portion did not come all the way out, and it was either partially done or hanging down. And so you literally had people deciphering which one got perforated and which one didn't. They're holding it up to the light. They're doing a seance over it to see if the ballot will tell them which one they voted for. It was a madhouse.
Yeah, it's a thick piece of paper. They call it a punch card because you literally punch a hole in it, as you're saying. And it's very thick, a kind of what we call cardstock paper. And as a result of the hanging chad and the questions, some that came up, they decided that they needed new voting machines in America. Now, I argued at that time, wait a minute, Florida was able to go back and recount that race properly. So what's the problem? Instead, what they did was they being quite a few states, us becoming the leading state for this, but that ushered in this new era of unverifiable electronic voting. And when I say that, what I mean is you have a touch screen for this new style system, which is snazzy and attractive. But the problem is, after you touch the votes on the screen, poof, they go away. You have no ballot. There's no way for the voter to verify the results. There's no way for an election official to audit the results because there's no ballot. There is no way to recount a race. You only can reprint the previous unverifiable results. And without a ballot, there's virtually no transparency. No one knows anything. The elections officials tell you who won, and no one, even the election officials, have no way to verify who actually won any election that's cast on these direct recorded electronic voting systems, which are known as DREs at that time.
And let's cap the Florida situation too, just for historical accuracy, because like I said, there are going to be younger people who have only voted on a machine. They don't know any of this stuff. So in Florida, what happened was both sides lawyered up. They sent some of the biggest legal names in the United States at the time. Bush had his, Gore had his. They all descended on Florida. They were going through. The attorney general for Florida was, I think, Jeb Bush, wasn't it? Or somebody. I can't remember who the attorney general was, but the attorney general was in on it from Florida. And so it went through the courts. Maybe this was the beginning of lawfare. I don't even know. But it ended up going to the Supreme Court of the United States. And the Supreme Court had to make a final decision on, this is the results. We're going to declare it conclusive, and this is the end of it. Now, because the Supreme Court had to decide this, the American people, Congress, everyone said, oh, we can't have this. We can't have the courts deciding elections for us. So Congress then goes, and they do what Congress does best, right? They start appropriating money all over the place, right? Billions of dollars from Congress that they're throwing at the states, and they give the money to the states, Garland, but they don't give them any standards. Is that right? They don't tell them what they need to do with the money. They just say, here's a lot of money, do something with it, right?
Well, that's right. There was the bill was called Help America Vote Act in 2002. It had some provisions in it, but not nearly enough. It established the Election Assistance Commission, and as you said, all of their guidelines are voluntary. We call them the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines. They issued those in 2005. That was volume 1. And all systems today are certified to 2005 standards. There was a provision in there for a paper audit trail, but they tried to claim that that wasn't what they meant. They didn't actually mean that it was a ballot audit trail, and there was a big hullabaloo about that, and it turned out to be meaningless. And as you said, Steve, there was really no significant standards out of that, but the vendors were happy because the states ended up buying new equipment on the federal taxpayer dime, and that equipment ended up disenfranchising virtually every voter who uses it in the entire country.
And there were several, as I recall, there were several vendors who were doing voting machines. Now, this was new territory for the United States, at least. I don't. It may have been used internationally, but no one really knew from a state perspective what they were looking for. You know, what the future problems were going, what the anticipated problems were going to be. You can tell the elected officials just really didn't think this through, and they just said, let's buy a computer and we'll vote by computer, without really thinking about what could possibly go wrong.
Exactly, and in Georgia became the test bed for a statewide implementation of this system, and the Secretary of State at that time, Kathy Cox, was warned, beware of this. Even the Fulton County Elections Director told her that you cannot recount a race with these machines. I wrote several letters, which I still have, to the Assistant Secretary of State and the professor who headed the evaluation, complaining that basically they were not verifiable to the voter nor auditable. And therefore, I believed it was a constitutional violation, even back then in 2002. It took 17 years later in 2019 before the United States District Court agreed with what I said back then in 2002, that the our systems are constitutionally deficient, and then they banned that system from future use in Georgia.
So let's look at this. So Secretary of State Kathy Cox says, I'll take your money, federal government. They go through this process of selecting a machine. The General Assembly passed Act 166, which was the 21st Century Voting Commission, which sounds like a fabulous thing. Everybody wants 21st century voting, right? So they passed that, and they're going to evaluate the vendors of digital voting systems. And in the Act 166, it says, and I'm quoting here, such voting machines shall be required to have an independent audit trail for each vote cast. Now, that sounds really good, right? That sounds like the way you should do it. Okay, but then what happens is Secretary Cox ignores that stipulation in Act 166, and she did not follow the commission's recommendations and for an audit trail, and she goes and buys the Diebold machines that don't have the audit trail. Now, go ahead.
Go ahead, Steve. Well, I'm just going to say. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, to your point, the Diebold machines, I remember them well. And here was the problem with the Diebold machines, exactly like you said. You put in a card, you vote, it's in the machine. Hopefully it's tabulating everything properly. Hopefully it hasn't been hacked. And hopefully it spits out the right results, right? You're just doing a lot of stuff on faith with a Diebold machine, right?
Well, right. And the other key little point here is that at that point in time, Kathy Cox did not have the money. Right. The money she made the commitment to buy the machines without having any federal money. And then, to your point, Steve, when you talked about the audit trail, she had a dilemma, because there was only one, maybe two machines that had an audit trail at that time. One of them wasn't even under consideration. And so she had a dilemma. The machines that she wanted to buy didn't have an audit trail. So what happened was, and you probably have it in your notes, the General Assembly had to remove that provision for an independent audit trail of each vote cast in order to clear the way for a legal purchase of a wholly unverifiable voting system that disenfranchised all of the voters in the state of Georgia.
And just to cross that T, what you just said, I'm going to cross the T here. That was February of 2002. it was Senator Jack Hill, a very powerful senator in the legislature, and he had to introduce Senate Bill 414. It removed all the requirements for an independent audit trail of each vote that was cast in the new voting system. That opened the door to purchase the Diebold systems. Now, go ahead.
And Steve, just to add one point to cross that T, the Jack Hill was a Republican, Kathy Cox was a Democrat. So there was bipartisan collusion in order to disenfranchise the voters of the state of Georgia.
And the interesting thing about the Diebold machines, and then I'm going to go into the shady end of how we got Diebold machines, but for those who have never used one, the younger voters who never used a Diebold machine, there is no paper copy. There's nothing that you put in hand or you put in a basket that says, this is how I voted. It's all on the computer. You pray that no one's hacked it, no one's done anything to the computer, and that it's going to spit out the right numbers. But now here's the problem. And I saw this in action in elections here in Georgia. The vote's too close. We need to do a recount. So what does a recount consist of on a Diebold machine? You push the same button you pushed the first time. That's all you can do. There is no verifiable way in terms of an alternative method of counting or anything else to look at this. You just have to push the same button you pushed before, and you're not going to get a different result. And if you do, then you've really got problems.
Exactly, Steve. And because it wasn't a legitimate recount, the legislature had to come up with a new term. So they called it a recanvass. So a recanvass means that we're reprinting the previous unverifiable results.
Right.
And one more little tidbit there, Steve, that you triggered my memory. So at that time, the original purchase was made. The system was called Global Election Systems, and Diebold purchased that as soon as they got the contract. That was a huge thing, and suddenly Diebold, which had a great reputation for banking, safe vaults, and all that.
ATM machines. They did a lot of stuff.
Yes, ATM. They suddenly are in the electronic voting system business, and they are not. They're totally ill-equipped to be doing that unless they had an ulterior motive, which we may not know about. But the founder of that Global was Bob Urosevich. Keep that name in mind. We'll probably come back. You'll probably hear that again before this hour is up.
Well, let me say the reason that Diebold got into this business, because it is lucrative, because Kathy Cox entered into a $54 million contract with them to purchase the electronic voting equipment that did not meet the requirements in Act 166 with the audit trail. Now, here's where it gets a little cloudy, murky, and maybe unethical, and makes you scratch your head and say, how did we possibly get here? The lobbyist for the vendor, Diebold, was Louis Massey, former Secretary of State of Georgia, whom Kathy Cox worked for, okay? He was part of the lobbying firm. Then this gentleman named Bruce Bowers joined with Massey. They were a partnership. Bruce Bowers just happened to be the son of one of the most powerful attorney generals that we've ever had in the state of Georgia, Michael Bowers. So here you've got two very interconnected elected officials or people who are related to elected officials, and they're prying the well here with Kathy Cox. And of course, Kathy chooses their product. So, right off the bat, the thing just stinks to high heaven. It just looks really, really bad.
Absolutely, Steve, and it gets better. And what that partnership did is it set up for the next Secretary of State, because now, as you said, you've got Lewis Massey, the former Democrat Secretary of State who Kathy Cox worked for, and then you have Bruce Bowers, son of Michael Bowers, who was the Republican Attorney General of the state of Georgia. So now you have a partnership between the Democrats and Republicans that leads to an interesting scenario, which I think you're about to get to.
Well, and let it just be said too that here they are, they're getting in these machines, and all of a sudden, as states start buying them, everybody starts going, oh my gosh, we've got some problems with these machines. Everybody started reporting problems with these machines right off the bat. Big mistake, which makes the lobbying effort from former elected officials and people connected to former elections even more fishy. But then they came up with a Senate Bill 500. That was the bill that required, again, that they wanted to do a permanent paper record. So it's like, okay, totally ignored once again. It never got passed. And the Georgia elections consisted of pushing a button on the vote. And if a recount was required, they pushed another button. Well, then in 2006, Representative Harry Geisinger introduced House Bill 790, and it was touted as one of the most comprehensive, verifiable voting bills ever introduced nationwide. So you think, all right, Georgia, we're on it. We were one of the first to get the machines. Maybe we made a mistake, but now, we're going 180 degrees and we're going to fix this thing. We're going to make it right. Okay. Well, there was just one problem. The bill was never allowed to make it out of committee because the state's election director, Kathy Rogers, adamantly opposed the legislation. She convinced them that they needed to stay with the faulty Diebold equipment. Now, here it comes. The plot thickens even more. Soon after, Director Rogers leaves her government position, and guess who she goes to work for? Diebold. Incredible. You couldn't write this as a novel. No one would believe it, Garland. How contorted this thing was, and all the interest. And like you said, it was bipartisan. I mean, there were people from both parties getting mixed up in this. Lots of money being thrown around, but you just couldn't write the script. No one would believe this.
Right. And it actually happened. This is all true, word for word.
And about this time, this is kind of when voter GA really started getting hot and heavy on this issue. And you guys really started voicing, having some news conference. Did y'all file any litigation at this point juncture?
We did. We filed our lawsuit to ban those voting systems in the state of Georgia, which eventually, in a couple of years, ended up in the Georgia Supreme Court, which we'll probably get to in a little bit. But that was when we formed Voter GA for the express purpose of bringing that suit to literally rid ourselves from this myriad of corruption that you've described.
Well, and we had an authority figure. It was an author named B. Harris, and wrote the book Black Box Voting. It actually became an HBO documentary, and it showed how unreliable these voting machines were. It exposed all of this. There were all these hackers that could just make those machines. You could elect Thomas Jefferson in a local election if you wanted to. That's how hackable these machines were. And here's what Harris said. The lawsuits against the state were some of the most important in America, and he demanded that the plaintiffs have their day in court. Now, what happened to the litigation that was filed? Did it proceed or?
Yeah. So that was Bev Harris. Bev wrote the book Black Box Voting. We call her the grandmother of the movement. So she's amazing gal. So we filed the case, and we had to keep. We literally got Representative Geisinger to call over and ask, well, where is our case? And finally, they came out and said that they had dismissed it. This was in the Fulton County Superior Court. And we looked at it, and there were 17 conclusions that had no basis in law and fact in the case. So we appealed this directly to the Georgia Supreme Court since it was an election case.
Now, if I remember correctly, that Fulton County judge said he was going to rule on the summary dismissal that was being requested. And he said he would have something in 5 days, and months and months and months went by. And I guess he was hoping that no one would pay attention and everybody would just start looking at something else.
And that's why
how did you finally force a ruling out of him? Was it Geisinger who did it?
Yeah, we got Representative Geisinger kept calling the office and say, where's the ruling? We need to know. The legislature needs to know. And that basically wrung it free eventually. And there's one more point to that story before we leave it. But back when we were talking about the lobbyists, we talked about the Democrat and Republican collusion. So when that played so well, but when Kathy Cox then left to run for governor, she got basically creamed because there were two, as you said earlier, there were two upsets in 2002 where the Republicans had won the Senate and gubernatorial elections. In what Sean Hannity called the earthquake in Georgia, the Democrats felt that they were cheated and they would not vote for her for governor. So that ruined her bid to get into the governor's mansion in Georgia. But then Kathy Cox then ran for Karen Handel ran for Secretary of State and won. So that lobbying effort just moved over to Karen Handel. Now they exercise the Republican side of that Massey Bowers alignment, and they were able to basically influence her office too, to the point where she hired one of their lobbyists as her assistant Secretary of State.
And let's make it abundantly clear. Karen Handel actually ran on a platform that she was going to rectify all the voting issues and take care of all this and sort it all out and do it. That was her primary platform issue. Republicans got behind her, probably some Democrats got behind her too, and she gets elected. Then you get the court ruling, and she cites the court ruling and says, all right, we're done with this. We're not going to do anything else. And there was also too, if you recall, there was a pilot program for voting machines that did give you a paper receipt that could be used for an audit trail. She killed that pilot program at the same time that the judge ruled against you in the lawsuit.
Yeah, and the pilot program was flawed because all the ballots came out in a row. We told them that wouldn't work to begin with. So, but yeah, that's exactly right. So it's a great point, Steve, because she wrote this white paper called The Basics, in which she said exactly what you described. She was going to fix all the problems. And then when the Supreme Court decision came down in 2009, she turned around and after saying we have all these problems, she's going to fix it. She says Georgia has the safest elections in the country.
Right.
Completely a 180-degree reversal.
I could not believe she made that statement, because we knew the machines across the country. People were saying these machines are horrible. And she literally said we were one of the safest, most accountable elections in the nation. Now, the plot thickens. Ethics Commission, somebody starts filing some complaints. The Ethics Commission looks into Karen Handel. They find that she had accumulated about $25,000 in campaign contributions from employees and family members connected with the voting machine vendor lobbyist Diebold from Massey and Bowers LLC. So
That's right.
here she is saying, I'm going to take care of all of this. Don't you worry, voters in Georgia. I've got it underhand. And at the same time, she's collecting money from the lobbyists who represent the voting machines.
Exactly, and then she appoints the one of the lobbyists for who works an employee of Massey Bowers, Rob Sims, as her assistant secretary of state.
And that would do nothing but help you keep a lid on the machines and all the stuff coming out.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, it's just absolutely incredible that you have this. Now, what were some of the 17? You have some of the what were some of the 17 conclusions that you drew on Judge Michael Johnson out of Fulton Superior Court? What were some of those conclusions? Do you recall that you found that you didn't think were accurate that he drew?
I'd have to go back and look at the document since it's been 19 years. So, but they were pretty obvious that he was just looking for a way to get out of the whole thing and rule against us, as we've seen over and over again since then.
Yes.
And in fact, he eventually went back into private practice after he made this decision.
Well, it's kind of interesting because Kathy Cox got into trouble with the voting machines. So she bails and she tries to run for governor, right? Karen Handel now has backtracked 180 degrees, disappointed a lot of her, supporters, didn't follow any of the guidelines that she said she would install. And then she decides she's going to run for governor. And then she backs out. She backs out and starts going. She resigns, and former state senator Brian Kemp is appointed Secretary of State. And
Yeah.
what does Kemp say?
And what's interesting about that, here's a little tidbit that I think it may not be in our history, but Brian Kemp was the other one. I mentioned that there were two upsets. I think it was at that time it was Saxby Chambliss had beaten Max Cleland, Sonny Perdue had beaten Roy Barnes for the gubernatorial race, Saxby for the Senate race, and then the other major upset was an upstart state senator from Athens who upset the incumbent Democrat, and his name was none other than Brian Kemp. Ever since then, in 2002, Brian Kemp wanted to become the Secretary of State. He actively worked for that, lobbied for that, and then Governor Perdue, after appointing one person who then quickly withdrew, then appointed Brian Kemp.
Yeah, I would have withdrawn from that thing in a heartbeat. No, with all the previous baggage, and there's no way I would have taken that position with what they were doing. Now, Kemp, I got this right here. He in January of 2010, Kemp told an audience that if the legislature introduced a bill to resolve the voting machine problem, that he, and I'm going to put this in quotes, would lead the charge, end quote. Did he lead the charge?
I remember that. I was there. I was there that day in the at the debate when he said that. It was a three-way debate, and because we had the Libertarian candidate David Chastain in that, and yeah, he said that. And no, he didn't lead the charge. 1 week later, I was really excited about that because 1 week later, I knew that the bill was going to be introduced by Tim Bearden, who, by the way, is now back in the legislature again. I think he was a judge for a while.
And just for the record, that was Bill 1215 that Bearden put forward. Bill 1215. Go ahead.
Yeah. And I think that was a House bill at the time. He may be in the Senate now.
It was House bill. Yeah.
Yeah. And so and I was excited because that was going to fix the problem. And so we looked for Brian Kemp to lead the charge. And suddenly he, again, just like Karen Handel did a 180-degree backflip and said, no, he couldn't he couldn't support the bill. I think he said it would cost too much money.
Right.
Uh,
He cited the cost of creating a verifiable voting system as his rationale. But Garland, we're talking about the core of our democratic republic here. If you can't get the voting system right, do you really have a government we're saving here? I can't believe that's the excuse. We can't afford it. You can always take money out of something and put it in something else.
Especially when you're talking about it was maybe $20 million, and they spent $54 million to disenfranchise us at the begin with in 2002.
Right. I mean, that was just numbing for me. And then problems began surfacing. Let me give you an example of some of the problems. Fulton County was tabulating votes using the Diebold machines. They somehow, mysteriously, the votes from one district ended up in the tally of the votes in another district, and nobody caught it until long afterwards when they had to tally the the numbers to see how many people actually came into the precincts to vote and whatnot. So that was one of them. Then they had, I know in Cobb County, they had a referendum, and they had 80 more votes tallied. It was 70, somewhere between 70 and 80 more votes than people who actually showed up to vote. And it's like, okay, how does that happen?
Yeah, and Cobb was an interesting story because they had two SPLOS, which are special purpose local option sales tax. And both of those SPLOS were the only thing on the ballot, and there were more blank voted ballots than there was in the margin of victory. And they were very, very tight, as you said, 70 ballots or so decided the race. So the question that we asked back then was, why would someone come into the poll, drive to the precinct, or maybe it was early voting at the time. I think it was only precinct for the first one. They come in, they register to vote, they get their ballot, they go into the polling booth, and they decide not to vote. So why would they do that? And that's what we were told. Obviously, it was a machine error of some kind, but both of those two SPLOS passed. And if I'm not mistaken, the combination of the two imposed a $1.5 billion tax liability on the people of Cobb County.
Right. And then to just add fuel to the fire, not only are we having hiccups around the state with these machines and tallies we can't explain, and how one votes from one district end up in the tally for another district, but the Center for Election Systems, CES, goes by the acronym CES. I believe that was through Kennesaw State. Was that correct? The CES? And all of a sudden, we found out they had all the voter data. They were doing, I guess they were subcontracted by the state. And they found out that that system was incredibly hackable and it had security flaws. So that was open. Their data, they found that was open to anyone who had access on the internet to it. Then on top of that, they found out that there were no backup copies of the data. So you couldn't tell if the data had been altered or anything had changed because there was not another copy in a secure location.
Can you believe that? Now, this is a professional, supposedly IT department for the Secretary of State. They claim that they maintain no backup copy. Steve, that's a very interesting story because it's one of the most major breaches in American history. So what happened there, and it would be worthwhile to walk through that a little bit more. As you said, well, let me back up. I'm going to give you a little bit of an explanation of how it works. So the Center for Election Systems has a dual reporting responsibility at that time to the Kennesaw State and to the Secretary of State's office. And they perform all the ballot programming for all the counties for all the elections. So everything comes through the Center for Election Systems there at Kennesaw State. It is a single point of attack. If you can compromise that location and that machine, you can control every election, every county in the state of Georgia. And what a white hat hacker named Logan Lamb found out was that that system, as you said, Steve, was wide open for anyone in the country to come in and hack, put malware on that system, and then it would be automatically downloaded to the counties for each election. They would not be able to detect it. They have no means to detect malware coming from the Secretary of State's office. And then they would do the bills for the voting machines themselves, the scanners, the tabulators. So all of that could have and likely was corrupted. And we would have found out all this, except for the fact, I think, as you mentioned there, that the Kennesaw State Center for Election Systems allowed the servers to be wiped and cleaned out the data just days after the original Curling v. Raffensperger case was filed, which at that time it was Curling v. Kemp back in 2017.
It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. And then later, Secretary of State Brian Kemp becomes Governor Brian Kemp. He led the movement to switch to the Dominion voting systems, and they had ballot marking devices. But there was a problem with the ballot marking devices. Tell us what that was.
Yes. And you know what, Steve, let me back up for a second because I just remembered another key point when you mentioned Brian Kemp. Brian Kemp was the Secretary of State when all this happened. Well, he was furious with Kennesaw State about this and with the Center for Election Systems. And he said that is just reckless disregard of procedures, incompetence, blah, 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 on. He went on and apparently not realizing that that unit, the Center for Election Systems, reports to him. And when he said all of that, the Attorney General withdrew from representing him for this curling case that was filed because he had basically incriminated himself. So it was a incredibly embarrassing moment. So, but then he got Ryan Germany, his legal counsel, to come in and write the report, a bogus 2-page report claiming that wiping the servers was a standard procedure that you would do in the event of a problem. Well, that might be true, but the first thing you would do is you would do a risk mitigation, and you would find out, well, who accessed the server? What was the IP addresses? When was it accessed? What did they have access to? What did they change? You would have done all that at a normal IT assessment. In that case, Secretary of State's office did none of that. They just wiped the data and then issued this report. To cover that up, and Ryan Germany was the legal counsel for not only Brian Kemp but Brad Raffensperger as well, who followed. So, sorry, I got off on a tangent, but I wanted to get that little piece in.
Well, and the average person on the street would say, why didn't you do some sort of forensic activity, all of that, to see what was going on? Give us some analysis, a forensic analysis on what's going on. And of course, getting rid of the evidence, that seems to be kind of the theme for government. Hillary hit the cell phones with a sledgehammer. It just seems... Yeah, get rid of them. It seems to be the government way of handling such things. But when we got into the Dominion voting systems, they had a paper blank paper ballot that they gave you that you would file and in your precinct. But there was a problem with the ballot that they gave you, the security paper. So what was the problem? Let's go back into that.
Well, there's multiple problems, Steve. So actually, we'll back up a little bit more. So how the Dominion systems came to be. So the legislature and finally came to the conclusion that we need a new system. So they had this bill, it's called House Bill 316 back in 2019, and they decided to buy a new system. But they mandated this ballot marking device system that you're talking about. That's a touchscreen, and they said, okay, this produces a paper trail. Oh, yeah, that's wonderful, except for the fact that the votes are in the code, the QR code that no one can verify. But the way this whole came to about was another amazing story that you probably are aware of, but it's worth repeating here. When they passed the bill, they put a 20-year bond on it, and the system only has a 10-year shelf life. So
I did not even know that.
yeah, and on top of that, they did it without a fiscal note. Now, a fiscal note would have been required because it was over $100 million expenditure, and it imposed a $10 million unfunded mandate on the counties totally every year for maintenance, licensing, certification, testing, and logistics. All of that was backloaded onto the counties when they cut the deal to buy the system. So the legislature mandated that a ballot marking device system had to be purchased, which the security experts just over and over again told them that was not, that BMDs are not secure enough. In fact, I have a paper on the voterga.org studies tab, which talks about the unresolved security risk of ballot marking devices. So that they ignored all that. They implemented the bill anyway, House Bill 316, despite all the financial boondoggle that it was. And then Brad Raffensperger came along and purchased this particular ballot marking device system, the Dominion Democracy Suite 5.5 system. He purchased that for $107 million. He and Gabriel Sterling signed the contract for that voting system, and that was equally, I would argue, equally disenfranchised us as did the old system. So,
And so,
yeah.
So you cast your votes on the screen, and then it prints out a piece of paper. But then when you put that paper into the reader is reading the QR code, right? So here I am. I'm staring at the QR code, and I can't verify whether it's the people I voted for or not because it's a series of dots and squiggles and a QR code. It doesn't tell me how I voted. So there's no way of knowing if the QR code is giving the accurate vote that you cast or not.
That's exactly right, Steve. And a couple of points there. So you might see the letters Steve Brown written as the candidate, but the QR code might say Garland Favorito for your same race. So that's one of the problems with the system. It's just completely as equally as unverifiable as the old system was back in. So that's and there's several more, but I'll stop there and.
I was going to say this issue with the QR codes caused you and your organization to get to the courts right away. And you went before the federal court. It was Amy Totenberg at the time. And trying to ask, what were you asking for in the federal courts related to the system?
Yeah, so we were asking for this system to be declared constitutionally deficient because it's not verifiable to the voter. And even if you had a QR code reader, you still wouldn't know what's in there because it's proprietary. And this time, our co-founder, Ricardo Davis, who I think you may know, was the plaintiff, one of the original plaintiffs in that case. And he then took that to the United States District Court. So we were in the Georgia State Court before in the Georgia Supreme Court. Now we're in the United States District Court with a different case, and there's two other groups of plaintiffs in that case.
And I believe they were asking for an injunction at the time, and Totenberg denied the injunction. And I believe I think her rationale was, and you confirm this for me, her rationale was, we don't have enough time. It's too close to the election. It'll be utter chaos. She didn't say, no, the voting machines are fine. They do everything that the law says they need to do. They're verifiable. She didn't say any of that. She just said, it's too close to the election, and I'm not going to chance utter chaos running into an election. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's accurate. And just to back up again a little bit, Judge Totenberg is the same judge who found, I think we mentioned earlier, found that the old system was in fact constitutionally deficient and banned them from future use. Now
Right.
she's faced, but she knew that they were going to get rid of that system anyway. Now she's faced with the fact that the new system is equally as unverifiable as the old system. And she has to admit that, yes, it is. And she makes this finding that says that the system is in violation of Georgia law. Now, she is in the United States District Court, so she's a federal court judge, but she says, yeah, this doesn't comply with Georgia law, and which I think you could be argued with as a 14th Amendment due process violation. But she makes that conclusion. But then, as you said, Steve, she says, well, this was done on October 11th of 2020, 3 weeks before the election. So the election was conducted on voting systems that the United States District Court says do not comply with Georgia law.
Right. I mean, what a quandary. I mean, just this whole thing from the beginning to the end just stinks to high heaven. Then we go to make it even, you just keep adding fuel to the fire here, Then we get into the 2020 election, right? And you've got a lot of sideshows going on. You've got Donald Trump saying a lot of things. You've got his attorneys. Rudy Giuliani is making a lot of claims. They're having a lot of press conferences. I thought it was very unfortunate that the Georgia Secretary of State's office under Raffensperger was kind of getting into a shouting contest with the Trump administration. Gabriel Sterling was getting into a name-calling battle with the President of the United States. And when you just thought it couldn't turn into any more of a circus than it was on every national television news broadcast. It was international news, and it was just incredible. Then there's the recording of Trump that was a staffer within the Secretary of State's office recorded the phone call. And then we had a whole set of lawfare, legal issues going on related to that. And you all had some litigation from the 2020 election too, related to Fulton County. Is that right? Tell us about that.
We did. That's a fascinating part of the story, Steve. So we had filed a lawsuit, Voter GA, because when we conducted the audit in Fulton County in 2020, but the auditors, I say Fulton County conducted the audit, not we, but the senior poll managers and audit monitors found counterfeit ballots in the 2020 election results. Now, they know that they were counterfeit ballots because they were mail-in ballots, and they weren't folded from being mailed. They weren't written with a writing instrument. They appeared to be toner copied. They were not on the correct paper stock, and they were voted the same way for dozens of ballots in a row, like they had just been inserted in math. So that's a dead giveaway that they are counterfeit ballots. So we filed a lawsuit to say it was an equal protection and due process lawsuit, because if counterfeit ballots have been stuffed into the count, that dilutes the votes of the other voters, and it's also a due process.
And Fulton County was pivotal in this race, right? I mean, their votes, because they were delayed, we were getting down to the nitty gritty where, anybody, if it swung one way or the other, that race is changed completely.
Yeah, that's exactly right, Steve. The end result was a margin of victory of 11,779 for the president. The presidential race, and then also the U.S. Senate race swung on a few more thousand votes than that, which drove John Ossoff and David Perdue into a runoff, even though David Perdue had won by tens of thousands of votes.
Yes. And then you've got this lawsuit with Fulton County. I believe it was poll worker Susie Voiles. Was she the one that noticed the discrepancies with the mail-in ballots, that they had no creases in them, they were never folded? So how can you have a mail-in ballot in a folded envelope and they have no creases on them or whatever? So she brought this up. Lawsuit's been filed. What's Fulton County's response with the ballots? I mean, obviously, you would think, all right, here, if you're on the up and up, here, let's review the ballots, right?
You would think that any elections officials whose integrity of their results had been questioned would want to bend over backwards to do everything that they could to show that they were in fact legitimate. Instead, Fulton County has done everything they can to fight us in court year after year to keep those ballots locked up so that the voters of the state of Georgia do not see them, because they would then know what actually happened in the 2020 election.
And there's only one reason why you wouldn't say, let's just look at the ballots, right? There's only one reason I can think of why you wouldn't allow the ballots to be viewed.
Right, and that is if they, in fact, that they will not reflect the results, and then the next question is, why don't they reflect the results?
Right. And of course, there were all kinds of reports of votes coming in the middle of the night, being brought in on pallets and all different kinds of things. Fulton County always seems to be the epicenter of our electoral, disruption. And,
yeah,
and they had several problems too with their election directors, right? They went through like 3 election directors or something. It was a real ordeal for them.
Yeah, and what we have found out since then, to fast forward a few years of history and then back up to 2020, but we found out that the ballot images, which are required to produce the cast vote record, you scan them and you get a ballot image. Those images were electronically altered before they certified the results. We now know that from getting access to the ballot images, which we had to get passed as law in 2021. And since that time, a state election board complaint 2023-025 has been filed, and it's found all kinds of problems. 3,900 votes were duplicated. It found all sorts of problems with the audit not matching. It appears that they had 17,800 and some odd votes, about images that had no cast vote records. No, I'm sorry, I got that backwards. There were 17,000 cast vote records, so 17,000 certified votes that don't have any ballot image. So how did you create those? So that's another question. And then it looks like they backfilled another 16,000 or so votes after the results were published. There's just all sorts of wrongdoing in that case, and they have fought tooth and nail to make sure that try to keep that covered up.
And signature matching was a big issue too, as I recall. Wasn't that one of the cases where signature matching had been totally neglected in some cases?
That is exactly right, Steve. Signature matching was, they finally admitted that they didn't perform signature matching in the 2020 election as required by law. That let in thousands of extra ballots that probably would have been rejected. Signature matching was a requirement at that time. And their machine did not even work. Their Blue Crest machine, they've acknowledged that in court. And based on the EAC statistics, I think they only had maybe about 6 ballots rejected, which should have been more like 6,000.
Right. And then in December 2022, the Supreme Court confirmed that your claims had standing, right? So they actually acknowledged that, you've got some validity in what you're saying here, and let's keep moving.
Yeah. So what happened there is we had raised that issue in the court. We had gotten an inspection. We were all ready to inspect the ballots. Then suddenly something happened. Somebody got to Judge Amira, and he suddenly decides that we don't have standing, which was absurd. We know that we had standing. We appealed it to the Court of Appeals, and amazingly, the Court of Appeals upheld the lower court decision. The judge who we believe wrote that opinion was immediately promoted by Governor Kemp to the Supreme Court of Georgia. Then, yeah, and then
you can't make this up,
you
Garland.
can't make it up. And then the Supreme Court does turn around, and he has to recuse himself. All the other Supreme Court justices said, "Oh no, wait! You always have standing to sue someone, an agency or official who violates the law." They made the decision without even us having a hearing. I was kind of looking forward to going to court on that, and then they made the decision unanimously. All Democrats and Republicans agreed that we do, in fact, have standing.
And at that point, Fulton County could not destroy the ballots. Is that correct? Is that what sealed the deal on them not being able to destroy them?
Yeah, Judge Amero had already put we had filed a motion to preserve the evidence, and he had upheld that even before we got to the Supreme Court. But yeah, so the Supreme Court then kicked that back, and that reactivated the rulings that the lower court had made.
Now, here you've got the Supreme Court siding with you. The evidence looks very much in your favor. We need to get our hands on those ballots. So obviously, you would think that the person in charge of the elections, Secretary Brad Raffensperger, would be patting you on the back and demanding that Fulton County turn over those ballots. Is that what happened?
No, the opposite happened, but you're right. That's exactly what should have happened, because you remember Brad Ravensburger is allegedly a Republican, and of course, the Fulton County is run by Democrats. So you would have expected it to go down exactly the way you described. Instead, Brad Raffensperger files an amicus brief to prevent us from looking at the ballots. And that amicus brief is signed by none other than Attorney General Chris Carr.
And why? How could you? I can't even dream up a rationale for why those two constitutional officers would do that. I can't even think of a rationale for that. I mean, that would be legally justifiable. I can think of some shady rationale for it, but I can't think of a good reason. What did they say? Did they give a rationale for that in their amicus brief?
Yeah, they filed an amicus brief. They tried to claim that it would be a felony if we were able to touch the ballots. It was a complete misinterpretation of Georgia law, done intentionally. The person who signed that is Charlene McGowan, who is still in the Secretary of State's office as a legal counsel now. There were a bunch of made up hodgepodge. In fact, we did a reply brief citing 6 or 7 false statements that were made in the brief. And then I think the CD Media, Georgia Record, did an article about that, all 6 or 7, and explaining how the amicus brief did not hold any water.
It was pretty much a propaganda piece to try to sway the judge and give him an out, I guess.
Right. The judge was looking for an out. He obviously was disturbed at that time. Somebody had told him, we can't see the ballots. It obviously came down at the last minute. Everything we had gotten ruling after ruling going our way as we've gone to court. Delay after delay, though. We get a little win, a little victory each time we go. Finally came down to just looking at them, and then suddenly all this happened. The judge just suddenly makes this incredibly bogus ruling based on this amicus brief, and the important thing is, Steve, the Secretary of State and Attorney General were not parties to this case. They did not intervene in the case. So, it was a very, very corrupt way to try to avoid transparency to the voters of the state of Georgia.
If I'm not mistaken, I think Raffensperger was declaring it one of the most accountable, respectable elections ever, right?
He at one time said it was the safest and most secure election in Georgia history, which obviously was crazy. Now, we can go a little bit deeper into some of these things that you'll probably find fascinating with Brad Raffensperger. So he went on NBC Today the day after the election, and he said that we now know that 4.7 million voters voted, a total of 40.7 million voters voted. We have 92% left to count, which is about 94,000. And at that time, Trump had a 103,750 vote lead. So he says the remaining votes to count will not impact or change the election results. And that's what he told NBC Today at somewhere around 9 o'clock on the morning after the election. Instead of 4.7 million, he certified just over 5 million ballots. So there's 300,000 ballots, which we do not know where they came from. This is after he was challenged by NBC Today, and they said, "Are you sure?" And he says, "We don't guess. We know those are the facts." So that changed the results of not only the presidential race, but it also changed the results of the Senate race, forcing David Perdue into a runoff. And we showed later on that from the secretary's own documentation that that was with 98% votes left to count, but at 99.5%, it was still the same thing. Trump had an insurmountable 50,000 plus vote lead, and as did David Perdue. He was 70 or 80,000 votes over the margin with 99.5% left to count, and it showed only the ballots in Fulton County were left to count, about 13 precincts. So what happened after that, no one knows probably but God. I'm not even sure Brad Raffensperger knows.
And you would just think that the people who are in charge would say, I owe it to the citizens of the state of Georgia to do some sort of forensic activity, go back, force us to look at the ballots, something. But let me read a statement. This is a statement from you, actually, in response to Fulton County desperately trying to destroy the ballots before anybody could get their hands on them. And this is what you said. Watching the attorneys make such ludicrous, dishonest arguments with a straight face while seeking to destroy the ballots and charge us fees for winning arguments in court against them only serves to remind me of the massive Fulton County corruption that threatens the voting rights of every Georgian. That was on June 26, 2024.
I had forgotten that I said that, but it sure is appropriate.
You nailed it. You nailed it. And the impact on the entire state, it was there. I also like the fact that Secretary Raffensperger wrote a book, and the book was on integrity and, all these wonderful values and virtues. And in that book, he had stated somewhere that, you can make a lot of claims. And I think he's kind of referring to people like you and voter GAs, all that is. You can make a lot of claims, but when you're under oath, it's amazing how the stories change, right? How everything shifts. Now, this was the same Secretary of State who refused to testify under oath in those trials. I just thought that was telling, that he said it's amazing when you're under oath how everything changes, and then he refused. And he was citing something, I don't know if it was a constitutional argument or a law, a statute. I don't know what the justification was, but he did refuse to testify under oath.
That's right. That was in the Curling v. Raffensperger case, and he said in his book, watch what's happened. If you really want to know what happened, watch what happened when you go to court. Well, he doesn't show up, and we use that over and over in the closing arguments to remind the judge that he didn't show, and there's no explanation for many, many things in that Secretary of State's office.
And that pretty much brings us up to very current. We're going to do a 2-part series, but we'll go to the next one in our next episode. But let's just bring this point. We'll finish it with this. Secretary Raffensperger knew, and this is according to a Politico article dated June 23rd of 2023. He knew about software vulnerabilities in the state's voting machine since at least 2023. However, he refused to initiate the software fixes before the 2024 election. What does that say?
Well, he actually knew all the way back to 2021. And that was when the report that Dr. Haldeman made, the security analysis, was sealed by the court for 2 years. But Ryan Germany and Brad Raffensperger had access to that report. And as you said, Steve, he knew about the vulnerabilities. But in fairness, although he denies this, but had he patched the system, it would not have solved the security vulnerabilities. Because what we now know, and we can talk about on our next episode, is that the Dominion voting system stores its encryption keys in clear plain text, which is a violation of the original 2005 guidelines under which it was allegedly certified by the EAC. So the system was never properly certified, and the patch would not have actually solved all the security problems in the system.
It just makes voting on paper looks so much better, doesn't it?
Amen, brother. Amen.
Well, we're going to end this episode here. And then in the next episode, we're going to go about some intentional ways that people were interfering with elections and so forth, and kind of go on what the possible solutions would be to the system we have now. So, Garland, thank you for sharing it with us and spending the time with us, and we'll catch it back up on episode number 2.
Great. Thank you, Steve.
Thank you so much for watching. I hope you'll like this episode. I hope you'll share it with your friends, and I hope you'll subscribe. We depend on you to help us get our numbers up and get the program out to everyone. I hope you found this helpful. Knowing the history of this voting machine debacle, there's no other way to describe it, is so important, because if you don't know the history, you don't know why everybody was disputing elections in 2020, why the experts were saying that, yes, you've got significant problems. That is something that we absolutely need to know. So I hope this episode fixes that for you. It gives you a clear understanding from 2020 forward, what has transpired, why it went wrong, and how it went wrong. So come over, visit us on the next episode, and we'll see you for part 2.